Welcome to Voices of IFES. In this episode, we have Vinoth Ramachandra. At World Assembly 2023, he talked during the evening about justice. He's an esteemed speaker and writer and veteran IFES advocate for social justice. He asserts that the pursuit of justice is foundational to discipleship, a way of life, and encourages us all to take practical steps to challenge injustice.
We began this World Assembly with Psalm 1:1. Blessed are those who do not walk in step with the wicked. The public teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount begins with 8 blesseds. And you could think of this as an 8-fold description of the character of a disciple. Alternatively, they can be understood as a description of those for whom the coming of Jesus is good news. In Matthew 5, verse 6, we read, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice." And a little further on, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of justice, for theirs is the kingdom of God." So for Jesus, his disciples are marked by a passion for justice, a passion that sometimes leads them to suffer persecution. So a person who claims to be a born-again Christian, but who has no passion, no concern for justice, is self-deceived. He or she is not a disciple of Jesus. Now, why? Because the good news that Jesus announced and enacted through his life and ministry was the dawning of God's kingdom, his liberating rule, which brings shalom. So Jesus announces that a new world order is on the horizon, and that is good news for those who have no stake in the present world order. Shalom is the Hebrew word for salvation. It's about wholeness, about the healing and the renewal of all our relationships with God, with each other, and with the non-human creation. Shalom is about humans flourishing in every dimension of their existence. And justice is basic to the experience of shalom. There can be no shalom without justice. Injustice impairs human flourishing. The Bible speaks of 2 kinds of justice, and following Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff, I shall call them reactive justice and primary justice. Reactive justice is about the punishment of wrongdoing. It comes into play when someone has wronged another person, treated them unjustly. And what that implies in turn is that reactive justice cannot be the only kind of justice. There has to be another kind of justice such that when someone violates it, reactive justice becomes relevant. Now that is primary justice. So reactive justice is the calling of law courts and magistrates, judges, what we call the executive arm of government. Primary justice applies to all of us. Justice in both these forms is at the heart of the biblical vision of life. I, Yahweh the Lord, love justice. That refrain runs right through the Old Testament. Why? Because God desires that each and every human being whom he has created shall flourish, shall experience shalom. So ask yourself, what brings about huge disparities in wealth, miserable living conditions, vulnerability to violence and crime, oppressive working relationships, shortages of food or vaccines, chronic health problems, high infant mortality? Such concerns and many others like this are often grouped together under the term injustice. As kingdom disciples, we are called to identify the places and the perpetrators of such injustices, to name structures of oppression, to articulate the silent cries and the groans of the suffering, and to campaign, to protest, to lobby, to put things right. But this also involves study, institution building, and sometimes acquiring sound legal knowledge. This is an area also where compromises often have to be made, and where we are called to work alongside non-Christians in confronting and addressing issues of shared concern. And sadly, non-Christians are often way ahead of us in this area. Primary justice is about recognizing, defending, and promoting rights. What do we mean when we talk about rights? A right is a legitimate claim that somebody has to some particular good. Most societies recognize different kinds of rights. There are some entitlements or rights which are based on achievement. If I were to win the marathon, very unlikely, but if I were to win the marathon at the Olympic Games, then I have a right to the gold medal. No one else enjoys that right apart from myself. If the judges were to refuse me the medal simply on account of my skin color or because of personal dislike, my right would be violated. There are other rights that are based on contract. If you promise to pay me to do some work for you and then refuse to pay me even though the work has been done to your satisfaction, I'm morally injured. My right to payment has been violated. There are other rights that society recognizes that are based on civic status or legal statute. For instance, a parent has rights with respect to his or her children, which others do not. A patient has a right to doctor confidentiality. A magistrate has a right to punish me, which others do not, and so on. Now, there's a special class of rights that we call natural human rights. And these are rights attached to the status of simply being a human being, a member of the species, Homo sapiens. Governments do not give us these rights, they can only acknowledge them. Historically, the notion of human rights has been grounded in the biblical truth that we are all created as God's image on earth, irrespective of our age, our gender, our color, our nationality, our sexual orientation, or whatever. And therefore, all of us, every single human being, has an intrinsic value, an intrinsic worth. And it follows that there are certain things that we should never do to any human being because they impair or damage that worth. And there are certain things that we should do for every human being because those actions recognize that worth. So the biblical writers are very clear that the way that we treat one another in the human family is an index of our relationship with God. Therefore, when we use the language of human rights, we are not appealing to the generosity of governments or civil institutions or other individuals. Rather, we are making a claim as a matter of justice to receive what is owed to us. We do not beg for our rights. We claim them. We demand them. However, rights language is often abused in our contemporary world, as for instance, when the abortion of unwanted babies is defended as an exercise in so-called reproductive rights, or when people degrade other human beings in pornography or hate speech, and then defend themselves by claiming the right to freedom of expression. In some societies, there is a pervasive victim mentality that also undermines any sense of moral obligation, and people respond to every misfortune or disappointment by demanding compensation, and every grievance they have is couched in the language of human rights. And for these reasons, there are many Christians who have come to view all talk of rights with suspicion. Now, I believe this is unfortunate. Remember that all our moral languages, not only the language of rights, but also the languages of duty, of obligation, of responsibility, all these can and are abused. And rights language is the only weapon that the poor and the oppressed can use against their own governments. And that's all the more reason Christians should be in the forefront of articulating and defending the rights of the oppressed against their own governments. And we show that we understand the language of rights when we defend the rights of those whom we deem our enemies, those who persecute us, those whom we don't like. It's only when we defend their rights, recognizing that they too are human, that we show that we understand the concept of natural human rights. Unlike the Western Republican tradition that puts the citizen, and historically the male property-owning citizen, at the center of the political community, the Christian biblical tradition gives ultimacy to the poor. And this follows naturally from the recognition that life is our most basic human right. The poor are all those whose lives are vulnerable, threatened, or denied. Whenever the Old Testament prophets speak of God's justice, when they urge their hearers to practice justice, when they complain to God about the absence of justice, they simply take it for granted that justice requires lifting up those people at the bottom, the widows, the orphans, the resident foreigners, and the economic poor. These are the invisible people in our societies, those who are routinely trampled upon. And while God cares about primary justice, He also calls us to ensure that reactive justice is done in our law courts, that those who are guilty be punished, that appropriate restitution be made to the victims of injustice. So let me give you some representative quotations from the Old Testament scriptures. Isaiah 1, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. And then addressing the wider world of nations and their rulers, give justice to the weak and the orphan, maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Psalm 82. Elsewhere, speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Lamentations 3, when all the prisoners of the land are crushed, when human rights are perverted in the presence of the Most High, when one's case is subverted, does the Lord not see it? Notice the language of rights, even human rights, more than 2,000 years before the French and English Enlightenments. The prophet Micah laments how every social institution in his day has become corrupt. Her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, the prophets tell fortunes for money, yet they lean upon the Lord and they say, is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. Jesus greatly expanded the category of the poor and the downtrodden to include not only the victims of sinful structures and practices, the widows, orphans, aliens, the economic poor, the unjustly imprisoned, but also those who are excluded from full participation in society because they are mentally afflicted, physically deformed, or seen as morally or religiously inferior. The inbreaking of God's just rule through the coming of Christ requires that these people too be lifted up. And Jesus denounced the way that God-given institutions, such as the law, the Torah, the Sabbath, the temple, these had been subverted by the ruling class to become institutions that exploited the poor and oppressed the vulnerable. To speak of the poor as having rights to sustenance and a right to a voice in the affairs of society implies that what we owe them is not simply charity, but justice. And this has profound personal and political implications. Early Christian theologians, the church fathers, challenged the absolutist understandings of wealth and property that undergirded Roman law. They taught that if I have food in my house that I don't need for my survival, but my next door neighbor is starving, then the food in my house belongs to him and his family and not to me. If he breaks in and takes that food, he's not stealing. It is I who commit theft as long as I refuse to share it with them, because the right to life trumps the right to private property. My friends, this is not Marxism. This is traditional Christian theology, which we have forgotten. So we need to ask ourselves, who are the equivalents in your society and my society of the widow, the orphan, and the alien? Who are the invisible people? Furthermore, biblical justice isn't a project that we undertake from time to time. Justice is a way of life. It's about aligning our lives with God's kingdom priorities and values. From the time we wake up until we go to bed at night, we make numerous decisions. We decide what clothes we're going to wear, what food to eat, how we're going to travel to work or to college or school, what we study, what work we will do when we graduate, where we will live, how to treat our friends, family, strangers, what to pray for, where to invest our money, and so on and so forth. And all these everyday choices and actions should be infused and animated by a passion for justice. So justice is a lifestyle, a Christian lifestyle. Social injustice and idolatry go together in prophetic condemnation. When people turn their backs on Yahweh, the God of justice, they also turn their backs on the poor, the widow, the orphan, the alien. And that's why the church is called both to tackling injustice and unmasking the idols, the God substitutes that sustain injustice. Just think of how power or technology or nationalism or national security or market forces, these have often become idols in our day. They justify the horrendous treatment of, say, refugees, and they justify the gross inequalities that we see both within our nations and between nations. And that is why the division in many of our churches and IFES movements between evangelism and social justice is utterly meaningless. And it is that meaningless division that I have fought all my time in IFES. If we continue to think of them as separate, It's because the evangel that we have inherited and are preaching is not the evangel of Jesus. The great South African theologian David Bosch reminds us, evangelism means enlisting people for the reign of God, liberating them from themselves, their sins, their entanglements, so that they will be free for God and neighbor. To win people to Jesus is to win their allegiance to God's priorities. And he goes on, once we recognize the identification of Jesus with the poor, we cannot any longer consider our own relation to the poor as a social ethics question. No, it is a gospel question. This does not preclude God's love for the non-poor, but in their case, a different kind of conversion is called for, which would include admitting complicity in the oppression of the poor and a turning away from the idols of money, race, and self-interest. So my second question to IFES movements, is the evangelism that we are doing converting students to God's heart for justice, or is it merely reinforcing their selfishness and their idolatries? And the other side of that question, is the social justice that Christians are promoting also unmasking the idols that sustain these structural injustices? Two questions to take back to your national movements. In the time that's left to me, let me give you some practical challenges. Firstly, challenge injustice in our universities, whether it's the sexual violence or harassment that we saw in the video from Chile, or think of bullying or cheating or racial or ethnic discrimination in your universities, poor facilities for international students, whatever they may be. Confront the authorities with others, non-Christians, who also care about these things. Secondly, use your academic training when you graduate to address social injustices in your nations and the wider world. In the first decade of the 20th century, Edward Caird, who was the master of a very rich college in Oxford University, England, challenged three of his best students, who are all Christians, to go to the poorest part of London and to find out what poverty is, why there is so much poverty in a country that is the richest in the world, and what can be done about it. These three young men, who all came from very privileged backgrounds, went and worked in the East End of London, which at that time was one gigantic slum. They were shocked by the conditions they found there. They became confused and angry as they began in a little way to experience the pain and the degradation of poverty. But they couldn't make friends with the poor because there were structural obstacles that stood in the way of a friendship of equals. They experienced an emotional and intellectual conversion. One of those students, a man called Richard Tawney, later became perhaps the greatest economic historian of the early 20th century. In his books, he condemned the British private school system, which entrenched deep class divisions in British society. He exposed the worship of mammon that was at the heart of national life. The second, a man called William Beveridge, became a civil servant. And at the end of the Second World War, his report, called the Beveridge Report, led to the creation of the welfare state and the National Health Service. Free health care from the cradle to the grave for everybody in Britain, whether they were citizens or resident foreigners. The third student, William Temple, was ordained as an Anglican priest, and he later became the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the highest position in the Anglican Church. Temple wrote a little book called Christianity and the Social Order, which sketched a blueprint of a new post-war Britain based on justice and equality. And it became the basis of the post-war welfare state. So here is my challenge to those of you who are staff workers or Christian professors. Do what Edward Caird did. Identify some of the best students you work with and give them a bigger vision for their lives than just collecting degrees, making money, or climbing up the social ladder. The third challenge, study the rich and the powerful. And this is going beyond Edward Caird's challenge. I've often quoted Susan George, who's a tireless campaigner for global economic justice, who once called on academics and development practitioners to study the rich and the powerful, not the poor and the powerless. She writes, I quote, "We still lack sufficient knowledge of those who make the decisions that affect countless lives and are in a position to manipulate the rules to suit themselves. That is, transnational corporations and banks, international finance institutions, global and regional trade bodies, right-wing think tanks, and so on." Begin with your own family. If they are excessively, inordinately rich, find out how did your family make their wealth. In most of our nations, it is the poor whose labor subsidizes the lifestyles of the rich. The COVID pandemic reminded us of how dependent all of us are on the work that the lowest paid members of our societies do. And the net financial flows in the world economy every year are not from the rich nations to the poor. It's from the poor to the rich. Interest on debt repayments, taxes or tariffs on exports, the falling prices of agricultural goods, largely caused by rich nations' farm subsidies. All these mean that the low-income nations transfer to the rich nations every year far more than what they receive in so-called aid or foreign direct investment. There's also the cost to poor nations of the export to the rich nations of engineers, scientists, doctors, nurses, accountants, most of whom have been trained in state universities at local taxpayers' expense. And they are actively recruited by rich nations, corporations, and governments. Moreover, corruption in poor countries would not be possible without the tacit support and often active involvement of rich corporations, banks, and governments in the global north, as well as in countries like China, Malaysia, Dubai, or Singapore. For every bribe taken, there is a bribe offered. And these bribes taken by our local politicians and business tycoons are stored not in local banks, but in the banking system that is owned and controlled by the rich nations. Offshore tax havens, most of which are the playgrounds of super-rich tourists in places like the Caribbean or Switzerland or Monaco. These are major means of tax evasion and money laundering. They're homes to vast pools of speculative capital, and these destabilize poor economies. Trillions of dollars, enough to pay for the entire health and education needs of the world's developing countries, are being siphoned off through offshore companies and tax havens. There's a popular saying that the church's prophetic role in society is to speak truth to power. But those in power know the truth. They just arrogantly ignore it, suppress it, or manipulate it in their own interests. So we should instead be speaking truth to the powerless. We should help them to see how they are being cheated, robbed, lied to. And don't be naive about technology. 2 justice questions, there are many, but just 2 justice questions that we should ask about any new technology are: A, whose interest does this technology promote? And who are made more vulnerable? And secondly, how are the benefits and the risks or the costs distributed? Justice demands that those who receive the most benefits should also be the ones who bear the greatest risks or costs, but often it's the opposite. Those who receive none of the benefits are the ones who end up bearing all the risks, the costs. The high-tech companies put out so much hype about, for instance, AI, that we are easily blinded and we don't ask these bigger questions. Kate Crawford, in a book that I recommend all of you, and especially those in IT, and all of you who have smartphones, she says the massive ecosystem of AI relies on many kinds of extractive practices, from harvesting the data made from our daily activities and expressions, to depleting natural resources, to exploiting human labor around the globe, so that this vast planetary network can be built and maintained. Finally, as graduates, remember that we are a privileged minority in most of our nations, perhaps not in the US or South Korea, but certainly elsewhere. The motto of the Graduate Christian Fellowship in Sri Lanka, going back to 1980, are the words of our Lord: "To whom much has been given, from them much will be expected." The higher up you go in society, see that you have friends who are not your peers. Sometimes get out of your cars and use public transport, or walk and talk with those who live on the streets. And don't underestimate the power of simple, faithful actions. For all social and political change begins in small ways. One example: in 1961, a young English lawyer, Peter Benenson, wrote a letter to the Observer newspaper in Britain. He suggested that people should come together and write to foreign embassies in their country, expressing their anger, their outrage at the imprisonment of political or religious dissidents. And that letter is how the organization Amnesty International began. Just one letter to your national newspapers. And finally, don't be discouraged by failure. We are called not to success, but to faithfulness. And political transformation often involves taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And sometimes we may feel that we are only going backwards. But the future of the world is not in our hands, it's in God's. So let me end with the words of the El Salvadorian Archbishop Oscar Romero, a tireless campaigner for human rights who was murdered while he was celebrating the Eucharist, murdered by government death squads. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for God's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this talk. We've got a new one dropping every Wednesday, and if you're loving what you hear, show us some love by subscribing and liking the podcast. And don't forget to stay connected with us on all social media platforms, including WhatsApp at IFES World.